This is how a world ends. Not with a bang, not with a whisper, but with the quiet, hydraulic hiss of closing elevator doors. For Junho, the polished steel box was a microcosm of his life. Cold, efficient, and reflective in ways that made looking too closely an act of self-incrimination. The air was thick with a perfume he didn't recognize from home, a sweet, cloying scent of cherry blossoms and youthful indiscretion clinging to the girl beside him. Minjun, in her crimson dress, was a slash of vibrant color against the muted chrome, a living, breathing mistake he couldn't undo. She was 18, a child playing dress-up in a world she couldn't possibly comprehend, her hand hovering nervously near his arm but never daring to touch. He kept his own hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid, a general surveying a battlefield of his own making. The soft, recessed lighting of the luxury penthouse elevator glinted off the face of his watch, each tick a countdown to an explosion he hadn't anticipated. They were descending from a place of secrets, a sterile apartment kept for just such occasions, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe he was safe. The ground floor was just 30 seconds away. Freedom. And then a hand, a slender, brown hand, adorned with a simple gold band he'd placed there himself, shot through the closing gap. The doors jolted and retracted with a soft chime of surrender. And there she was, Lena, his wife. Her presence filled the space, not with noise, but with an impossible, suffocating gravity. She wore a simple beige dress that did little to conceal the perfect, round swell of their future, their daughter, nestled safely within her. Her eyes, usually so full of warmth, were calm, impossibly calm, as they moved from his face to the girl in the red dress, and then back again. The doors slid shut behind her, encasing the three of them in a mirrored tomb. The only sound was the faint hum of the machinery, a low thrum that vibrated through the floor, a funeral dirge for the life he had just irrevocably destroyed. The elevator was a cage of judgment, its mirrored walls reflecting a trinity of betrayal. On one side, Junho stood frozen, his tailored suit a useless armor against the silent accusation in his wife's gaze. He was a man accustomed to control, to orchestrating violence and loyalty with the same detached precision, yet in this confined space, he was utterly powerless. His authority, a currency that bought fear and respect in the city's underbelly, was worthless here. Opposite him, Minjun seemed to shrink, the bold red of her dress now looking like a warning, a stain. She stared at her own reflection as if seeing a stranger, her youth a fragile, brittle thing. She was a doll, beautiful and breakable, caught in the gears of a machine far older and more complex than she was. But it was Lena who commanded the room. She didn't need to raise her voice or shed a tear. Her power was in her stillness. She leaned against the cool brass railing, one hand resting protectively over her swollen abdomen, an anchor in a violently shifting sea. Have you ever seen a storm gather in complete silence? It's a terrifying sight. The air grows heavy, the light changes, and you know, with primal certainty, that something devastating is about to break. That was Lena. She was the calm at the center of a hurricane she had just walked into. The beige of her dress was the color of sand, of the earth, solid, enduring. It was a stark contrast to Minjun's fleeting, passionate red. The light from above caught the soft curve of her cheek, illuminating a strength that Junho had always admired but had, he now realized, tragically underestimated. He watched her breathe, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to mock the frantic hammering in his own chest. She was not just his wife, she was the keeper of his legacy, the mother of his child, the one person whose faith in him was the foundation upon which he'd built his entire, complicated life. And he had just dynamited that foundation. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, until it felt like it would snap. It was Lena who finally cut through it, her voice not sharp, but low and steady, a stone skipping across a frozen lake. I thought you had a meeting with the port commissioners. It wasn't an accusation, not yet. It was a fact, a piece of their shared reality. She was holding up to the light, inspecting it for cracks. The mundane detail of it was a masterful stroke of cruelty, grounding the surreal horror of the moment in the simple, everyday lie he had told her just that morning. He could feel Minjun's terrified gaze on him, seeking a cue, a line, some direction in this scene she hadn't rehearsed. He gave her none. His focus was entirely on Lena. It was postponed. The words were gravel in his throat, a pathetic shovelful of dirt on a gaping grave. He saw the flicker in Lena's eyes, not of anger, but of something far worse, disappointment. It was the look of a person who had expected better, who had held a version of him in her mind that was noble and true, and was now watching it crumble into dust. She knew. Of course she knew. He had been careless, arrogant, blinded by the ease of his deceptions. He had mistaken her trust for ignorance. Postponed, she repeated softly, the word hanging in the air like smoke. She took a small step forward, her movement fluid and deliberate. The elevator felt impossibly smaller. Her gaze drifted to Minjun, a slow, clinical assessment that stripped the girl of her youthful allure, leaving only a frightened child in an ill-fitting dress. Minjun flinched, her eyes darting to the floor indicator as if praying for a swift escape. But there was no escape. They were locked in this moment together, hurtling downwards in a state of suspended animation. As if summoned by the escalating tension, the elevator gave a sudden, violent lurch and shuddered to a halt. The lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized, casting the three figures in a stark, unforgiving glare. A low, mechanical groan echoed from above, followed by an unnerving silence. They were trapped, not just by the circumstances, but by four walls of polished steel, suspended somewhere between the sky and the earth. Minjun let out a small, terrified gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. For Junho, the mechanical failure was a physical manifestation of his own internal collapse. The control he so meticulously maintained had shattered, both in his life and in this metal box. Lena, however, seemed unaffected by the sudden stop. Her hand remained on her belly, a gesture of primal, maternal protection. It was a silent, powerful declaration. This is what matters. This is the life you have jeopardized. The breakdown of the elevator stripped away the final pretense of civility. They were no longer just three people sharing an awkward ride. They were prisoners in a cell of his design. Lena finally turned her full attention back to him, her voice losing its earlier restraint, replaced by a cold, sharp edge. Don't lie to me anymore, Junho. Who is she? The question was a blade, direct and unavoidable. There was no room for evasion, no space to maneuver. The mirrored walls threw their images back at them from every angle. The guilty husband, the terrified mistress, the betrayed wife. A hideous, inescapable triptych of his failure. He could see his own reflection over Lena's shoulder, a man he barely recognized, his expression a mask of strained composure. He looked at the girl cowering in the corner, her vibrant dress now a flag of surrender. Then he looked at his wife, the mother of his unborn child, her eyes demanding the truth he had so cowardly withheld. It was a trial, and he was the only one on the stand. The truth did not come in a flood, but in a slow, agonizing trickle, each word a stone he was forced to swallow. She works at the club, he said, his voice a low rasp. It was a pathetic, partial truth, an attempt to minimize, to categorize. He was framing Minjun as a transactional folly, a simple mistake of the flesh. But Lena would not allow him such an easy escape. She knew him too well. She knew the cold pragmatism that governed his world, but she also knew the hidden currents of sentimentality he tried so desperately to conceal. The club, Lena repeated, her tone laced with a weary irony. Of course. Is that what they call the apartments on the 34th floor now? A club? Her knowledge was a physical blow. She hadn't just suspected, she had investigated. The thought of her, heavy with his child, piecing together the sordid details of his betrayal, the receipts, the late nights, the fabricated meetings, sent a wave of shame through him so profound it almost buckled his knees. It was then that Minjun, finding some small, desperate sliver of courage, decided to speak. Her voice was thin, reedy, the sound of a frightened bird. "He told me you didn't love him anymore," she whispered, her words directed at Lena. "He said you were only staying together for the baby." The revelation landed in the silent elevator with the force of a bomb. It was a lie more damaging than the affair itself. He hadn't just cheated on his wife. He had rewritten their history, erased their love, and used their unborn child as a prop in his tawdry little drama. Lena's head snapped toward him, her calm finally, terrifyingly, breaking. The hurt in her eyes was so raw, so deep, it was like looking into an open wound. He had not only broken her trust, he had desecrated their memory. He had taken the sacred narrative of their life together and twisted it into a cheap lie to seduce a child. The dam of Lena's composure finally broke, but it wasn't a torrent of rage. It was something far more devastating. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent, liquid testament to her pain. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely audible, a fragile thing that threatened to shatter with every word. "Was any of it real?" she asked, the question aimed not at his mind, but at the very core of his soul. "The night you told me you wanted a family? The way you held my hand at the first ultrasound, when you said you heard our daughter's heartbeat, and it was the only music that mattered." She wasn't just listing memories, she was presenting exhibits of their shared life, forcing him to confront the sincerity of his own past. Each memory was a jewel he had now coated in filth. "This baby," she continued, her hand trembling as it rested on her stomach, "our little girl, was she just a pawn? A convenient excuse for you to stay while you looked for something else?" Junho felt the air leave his lungs. Of all the men he had faced, all the threats he had neutralized, nothing had ever disarmed him like this. He was stripped bare, his sins laid out under the harsh fluorescent lights. He saw the full scope of his destruction, not in terms of business or power, but in the wreckage of a woman's heart, the heart of the only woman he had ever truly loved. He took a hesitant step toward her, his hand outstretched, an instinctual, desperate plea for contact, for a chance to rewind time. "Lena, Before his fingers could even brush her arm, she flinched back as if he were fire, her body recoiling from his touch. The small, sharp movement was a verdict. It was a physical rejection so complete, so final, that it echoed louder than any shout. The space between them was no longer just a few feet of tiled floor. It was a chasm, wide and uncrossable. In that moment, the powerful Mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man utterly, hopelessly lost. Just as the emotional tension reached its breaking point, a loud clank echoed from above, and with a gentle jolt, the elevator resumed its descent. The spell was broken. The resumption of movement was an intrusion, a return to a world that was now irrevocably altered. The low hum of the machinery filled the suffocating silence, providing a mundane soundtrack to their fractured lives. The three of them retreated into their own private worlds, the mirrored walls now reflecting only their isolation. Junho stared at his own image, but he didn't see the man he presented to the world. He saw the hollowed-out eyes of his father, a man who also had a talent for breaking the things he loved. He saw the lie he had become, a man who preached loyalty while practicing deceit. He had built an empire on a foundation of honor among thieves, yet he had shown none to the one person who deserved it most. What kind of man builds a fortress to protect his family, only to set it on fire from the inside? Lena turned away from him, facing the doors, her reflection showing a profile of quiet, determined sorrow. Her focus was inward on the tiny, persistent kicks from within. A flutter of life, a promise of a future that was now shrouded in uncertainty. That tiny, innocent being was a compass, and in that moment, Lena knew her true north was no longer the man standing behind her. The baby was her anchor, her purpose, her reason to survive this shipwreck. Minjun, meanwhile, seemed to have folded in on herself, her vibrant red dress now a source of shame. She stared at the polished floor, at the reflection of the descending floor numbers, wishing them to move faster, to deliver her from this waking nightmare. The glamour of being with a powerful man had evaporated, leaving behind a sticky, bitter residue of humiliation. She wasn't a femme fatale, she was collateral damage, a foolish girl who had mistaken a predator's attention for affection. The descent was only a few more seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Each floor they passed a milestone marking the end of a life they had once known. The elevator chimed its arrival, a soft, melodic sound that was grotesquely cheerful. The polished steel doors slid open, revealing the grand, sterile lobby of the apartment building. The sudden influx of light and space was a shock after the claustrophobic intimacy of their descent. For a moment, no one moved. They were frozen on the threshold between their private hell and the public world. Then, as if released from a trance, Min-jun bolted. She didn't look back, didn't offer a word of apology or explanation. She simply fled, a streak of red vanishing through the revolving glass doors and into the unforgiving anonymity of the city. Her departure left a vacuum, a silence that was heavier and more profound than before. Junho and Lena were left alone, standing in the open elevator, the space between them now a tangible, yawning void. The muted sounds of the lobby, the distant murmur of conversation, the soft click of heels on marble, seemed to come from another world. Junho finally found his voice, a choked, broken thing. "Lena," he began, but the name was all he could manage. What could he possibly say? What apology could ever be enough to bridge the chasm he had created? Lena didn't look at him. She stepped out of the elevator, her movements slow and weighted, as if every step required a monumental effort. She walked across the marble floor, her simple beige dress a study in quiet dignity. She didn't run. She didn't hurry. Her pace was deliberate, final. Each footstep on the polished stone was an echo of a door closing, a lock turning. He watched her go, his feet rooted to the floor. He, a man who could command a dozen men to their deaths with a single nod, could not will himself to take a single step to follow her. He watched until she disappeared through the same doors as the other woman, leaving him alone with the reflection of his own failure in the cold, unforgiving steel. The days that followed were a blur of suffocating silence. Their sprawling penthouse, once a sanctuary of shared dreams and quiet comfort, became a mausoleum. Every object held a memory, every room echoed with the ghost of her laughter. Junho walked through the spaces they had designed together, the minimalist decor now feeling stark and accusatory. He'd sit in the dark, the city lights twinkling below like a galaxy of indifferent stars, a bottle of expensive whiskey, his only companion. He had tried to call, of course, dozens of times. Each call went straight to voicemail, her recorded voice a cheerful, painful reminder of the woman he had lost. He sent texts, long, rambling apologies typed out with trembling fingers, each one disappearing into the digital ether, unanswered. He had dispatched his men to find her, not to bring her back by force, but just to know she was safe. They reported that she was staying with her sister across town, that she was physically well, but refused to see him. He was a king in a gilded cage, his power utterly useless. He could move mountains of illicit goods across international borders, but he couldn't cross a few miles of city traffic to reach his own wife. What does a man who solves every problem with intimidation or violence do when the problem is a broken heart? You can't threaten a memory. You can't buy back trust. He was adrift, stripped of his purpose. The empire he had built, the legacy he was meant to pass on, felt like a hollow monument to his own ego. It meant nothing without her. Then, one evening, as he stared blankly at the city skyline, his phone rang. It wasn't her number. He answered with a surge of desperate hope. It was Lena's sister, her voice strained and devoid of any warmth. "It's time," she said, the words clipped and final. "She's at St. Michael's Hospital. The baby is coming." The line went dead. The words hung in the air, a lifeline and a death sentence all at once. The moment of reckoning was no longer in a descending elevator, but in a hospital room where a new life, his daughter's life, was about to begin. He drove like a madman, the city lights blurring into streaks of red and gold. The rules of the road, like the rules of his own life, seemed irrelevant. All that mattered was getting there. He ran through the automatic doors of St. Michael's, his expensive suit disheveled, his face etched with a fear he had never known. He was a man who had faced down assassins and federal agents without flinching, yet the thought of facing Lena again made his blood run cold. He found a room on the maternity ward, the door slightly ajar. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his hand hovering over the handle, a supplicant at the gates of his own future. He was terrified of what he would find inside. Anger? Indifference? A world that had already moved on without him? Taking a breath that did little to calm the storm in his chest, he pushed the door open. The scene inside was quiet, almost serene. The chaos of birth was over. Lena was propped up against a mountain of pillows, her face pale and exhausted, but her eyes held a fierce, transcendent strength. And in her arms, swaddled in a soft pink blanket, was the most perfect, most fragile creature he had ever seen. A tiny, sleeping baby. His daughter. He took a hesitant step into the room, then another, his feet feeling heavy as lead. He stopped at the foot of the bed, a silent, broken king surveying a kingdom he had no right to claim. Lena looked up, her gaze meeting his. There was no hatred in her eyes, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. He had expected a storm, but he was met with a quiet calm that follows one. After a long, silent moment, she spoke, her voice soft and raw. "Come here," she said. It wasn't a command or an invitation. It was a simple statement of fact. He moved to her bedside, his eyes fixed on the tiny face of his child. She had a full head of dark, curly hair, and her tiny rosebud mouth moved in her sleep. He felt a love so fierce, so absolute, it was physically painful. "She has your eyes," Lena whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. He finally looked at his wife, truly looked at her, and saw not the woman he had wronged, but the warrior who had brought their daughter into the world. He reached out, his hand shaking, and gently touched the baby's cheek. "She has our name," he replied, his voice breaking. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't forgiveness. But in that hospital room, with the scent of new life in the air, it was a beginning. A fragile, uncertain, but desperately hoped-for beginning.